Harriet A., Washington, A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind. In A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind, Harriet A. Washington exposes the devastating impact of environmental toxins on communities of color, emphasizing the adverse effects on children's cognitive development. This well-researched book sheds light on the long-standing intellectual toll caused by air pollution, untested industrial chemicals, toxic metals, and infectious diseases. Washington not only demonstrates how these factors have resulted in behavioral problems, academic disabilities, and decreased IQ scores, but also unravels the U.S.'s history of bias and corporate greed. Understanding the intricacies of environmental racism asserted in this book will allow readers to grasp the enormity of its effect and inspire action for change.
Toxic Threats to Developing Brains. Harriet A. Washington's book explores the impact of air pollution, industrial chemicals, toxic metals, and infectious diseases on children's brain development. She explains how exposure to these toxins leads to long-term cognitive impairments like behavioral problems, learning disabilities, and reduced IQ levels in communities of color. Washington highlights the history of bias and corporate greed in the United States that perpetuates environmental racism. The updated edition features a new preface discussing the risks associated with COVID-19. This deeply researched and timely book exposes the catastrophic effects of environmental racism and calls for changes in environmental policy. IQ and Race. In her book, Washington challenges the idea that intelligence is determined by genetics and argues that systemic racism plays a role in the IQ gap between white and black Americans. She provides evidence that when the government added iodine to salt to cure nutritional deficiencies, overall IQ increased by 15 points. Washington also highlights the impact of environmental factors, such as exposure to industrial chemicals in sacrifice zones, that can lower IQ. She contends that race is a social construct and that medical outcomes are influenced by societal perceptions. Overall, Washington rejects the hereditarian view and calls attention to the impact of systemic racism. Lead poisoning, an invisible threat. Lead poisoning affects mostly African American children in Baltimore, and is caused by emissions, legacy pipes in homes and water systems. The consequences include slow growth, lower IQ, mental retardation, anemia, and even heart and kidney problems. There is no safe level of lead exposure, and the harmful effects cost the U.S. 23 million IQ points every year. Race and hazardous facilities. Race is a more significant factor in determining the location of hazardous waste sites than socioeconomic status, according to a report by the author. Washington highlights how minority communities near chemical plants are subjected to significantly higher rates of pollution. For instance, the number of African Americans living in such areas is 75% higher than the U.S. average. The author offers Flint, Michigan, as an example, where predominantly African American communities were exposed to pollutants from a polluted river following a decision by state authorities. Additionally, Louisiana dumps 64% of its industrial waste in predominantly black communities known as Cancer Alley. Washington also reveals that the U.S. only safety tests a small portion of the 85,000 industrial chemicals used in the country, leaving communities at risk of exposure to toxic chemicals. Small doses of these toxic chemicals can cause significant intellectual and behavioral harm, she argues. Hazards lurking in baby food. In her book, Washington brings to light the dangers posed by toxins in our environment, food, and water to children, especially those in poor neighborhoods. She emphasizes the alarming levels of arsenic and lead in baby food, detailing how babies, due to their small body size and greater surface area, are twice more vulnerable to poison exposure than adults. The author stresses that the blame for adverse pregnancy outcomes among black mothers is often misplaced, given the prevalence of environmental hazards in their neighborhoods. Washington thus advocates for greater political will to ensure environmental safety, calling for collective activism to force the government's hand. Racism and environmental injustice. In A Terrible Thing to Waste, Harriet A. Washington debunks racist theories of innate intelligence differences between white and black/brown Americans and connects it to the environmental injustice that poor communities face. Washington's informative book features compelling statistics and examples of how waste products and outputs from industries have destroyed the health and lives of America's poor. She presents these complex ideas in an accessible voice that can benefit students, politicians, activists, medical personnel, NGOs, and ordinary citizens. Recommended parallel reads include Mediocre by Ijeoma Oluo and Just Medicine by Dana Bowen Matthew.
As Harriet A. Washington masterfully reveals in A Terrible Thing to Waste, environmental racism has insidiously affected marginalized communities, leaving children with decreased cognitive abilities and poor health outcomes. Washington points to alarming examples, ranging from Flint, Michigan's poisoned water crisis to Louisiana's Cancer Alley, shedding light on the nation's stark inequalities. She emphasizes the need for stronger environmental policies and safety testing of industrial chemicals to protect vulnerable populations. Ultimately, the book calls for collective political will and citizen-led efforts to counteract environmental injustice, pressing the message that race is a socially constructed concept and should not be determinative of one's medical fate. This book serves as an essential wake-up call for all concerned individuals, enabling them to understand the lasting impacts of environmental racism on children's cognitive development and advocate for greater change.